scholars, academicians, senior professors, everyone who's come in here to join us for this panel discussion. This is, in fact, sort of run up to the 50th All India Sociological Conference that we are having this year in December. And we thought in the run-up, we would sort of build up and have panel discussions and workshops online. So this was one of the ways we thought we would do it. And it is 3 RCs, research committees and an ad hoc group: RC-15, Agrarian and Rural Studies; RC-11, Sociology of Environment; and the ad hoc group 03 on Food, Culture and Society. We got together and decided that let's have this panel discussion. So I welcome all of you to this panel discussion. Today we have 3 very interesting and well-known distinguished scholars with us. I am honored to introduce the 3 scholars. Professor R Vasavi is a social anthropologist based in Karnataka, India. She received her master's in the Department of Sociology, Delhi University, and her PhD in social anthropology from the Michigan State University. She was faculty at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, from 1997 to 2011, and a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, and visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Diversity and Religion at Göttingen, Germany. Her academic interests are in sociology of India, agrarian studies, and sociology of education, and she has conducted her field research in various parts of India. Her publications include Harbingers of Rain, Land and Life in South India, Oxford University publication, 1999, In an Outpost of the Global Economy, co-edited with Professor Carol Upadhyay, Routledge, 2008. The Inner Mirror, translations of Kannada writings which are on society and culture, which is also available in Kannada. She's also published a volume it's been published from the Kannada University Hampi, has brought out a collection of her writings, which have been translated into Kannada. Her most recent publication is the book Differentiation and Disjunction, Interrogating India's Education System, by Orion Black Swan, 2022. In 2010, she initiated the Network for Rural and Agrarian Studies, which is now an all-India network with more than 300 members. She's co-author of the report State of Rural and Agrarian India, 2020, which the NRAS published in 2020. She's currently a member of the Punarchit Collective that works on alternative learning and is based in Karnataka. In 2013, she was awarded the Infosys Prize for Social Sciences, and in 2018, she received the Malcolm Adiseshaya Award for Sociology. Welcome, Professor Vasavi. Today with us, Professor Aniket Aga. He is the author of Genetically Modified Democracy, Transgenic Crops in Contemporary India, Yale University Press, Orion Black Swan 2022, which won the 22 Fleck Best Book Prize from the International Society for the Social Studies of Science. His research lies at the intersection of science and technology, development and democracy. He has co-directed the ethnographic documentary film Seed Stories. Set in the Niyamgiri Mountains, the film takes up issues of heirloom seeds, agroecology, and GM cotton through the voices of ecologists and expert Adivasi women farmers. His article on pesticide marketing and caste won the 2019-20 Krishna Bharadwaj Eric Wolf Prize from the Journal of Peasant Studies. He collaborates with journalists and activists and has published in the Journal of Agrarian Chain, Scientific American, and Article 14, among others. He's currently conducting research on the Right to Information Act and struggles over information and democratization. Welcome, Professor Aga. We also have Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy. She's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, and a non-resident scholar at the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, where she previously held a postdoctoral fellowship. Prior to joining Ashoka, she taught at the Department of Sociology, Shiv Nadar University. Mekhala's work engages most deeply with classical and contemporary questions, animating the anthropology of the state and market. Her doctoral research and book project explores the changing social, economic, and political lives and relationships of an agricultural market, mandi, in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. As a result of prolonged exposure to mandi life, Mekhala has developed an abiding interest in grappling with the diversity, complexity, and dynamism of agricultural markets, regional capitalism, and economic life in India. Welcome, Professor Mekhala. Uh, I'm sure there's going to be a very interesting panel discussion, and there'll be lots of discussions and debates following this discussion. And I hope this sort of sets off the trend in these three RCs for which we are also trying to sort of drum up membership for this. Thank you so much. Over to you, Rituparna.
Okay, so thank you, Manisha. I invite Dr. Aga to first begin his deliberation, and then we'll follow with the other two speakers.
So thank you very much for the invitation, Rituparna, Chandrasekhar, Manisha. And it is a great pleasure to be here with this panel and particularly with Vasavi, who's been like a mentor to so many of us through the NRAS, beyond the NRAS, through her research and scholarship, and then in so many ways that go far beyond. Now, of course, the topic for today, which is sustaining inequality, agrarian change, food cultures, and ecological futures, is a very vast topic. So I'm going to just make a few brief points in opening so that we can move to more of a discussion later. So just quick, maybe 5 points. First is that I noticed there's a question mark after the sustaining inequality, and I would just like to start by saying that there is absolutely no doubt that the current food regime produces, sustains, and exacerbates inequality. I mean, this is a food system whose structure, whose sciences, whose very epistemology, all of these were produced in the shadow of colonialism, and which was geared and is geared towards keeping vast sections of the world, and particularly its primary producers, farmers, artisans, with all the heterogeneities within these groups in subordinate positions. And of course, this food regime did not create social hierarchies. I mean, in the case of India and South Asia, landholding, which is closely linked to caste. This food regime did not create these social hierarchies, not just caste, also of race, of class, etc., gender, patriarchy, but it certainly is quite friendly to these hierarchies, to the principles of these hierarchies, and retools them and keeps and re-articulates them. Second, this food regime erodes diverse food cultures, which is the second part, the second sub-theme of the subtitle, and food cultures that have evolved through history that are place and ecology specific. It promises abundance, but it is really not abundant. It does not generate abundance at all. What it does is it produces massive surpluses in a few grains, in the main rice, wheat, corn, soybean, and then a few meats, in the main chicken, beef, pork, and then again, it's really debatable whether the broiler chicken, which is I think the predominantly the meat that is consumed in India, if to what extent is it really the chicken as say our great grandparents would have known the fowl or the bird. So it produces massive surpluses in a few grains and a few meats. It destroys all other kinds of nutritional, food cultural, taste, aroma, all these kinds of diversity. And this promise is of actually none of what I'm saying here is particularly new or novel. Much of this has been written about in sociology for decades, if not a century. But I still feel it's important to say this because the discourse of capital intensive agriculture remains hegemonic. People basically who have not managed to feed their own neighborhoods in about 70 years and more still keep asking, how are we going to feed the world? Except that we are not in 1950s when the Green Revolution was being debated. We are not even in early 2000s when globalization was being debated. We are in 2025, 4 years out of a pandemic, very likely triggered by unsustainable agriculture. So I think at this point we should really boldly call out this bluff of expert policymakers and loudly say that this model cannot feed the world. It is structurally incapable of feeding the world. And at least as long as we are talking about food in its real cultural historical sense, it can provide calories to keep the impoverished, the undernourished from the brink of starvation and death. Yes, that it can do. But is that all we aspire to when we say food? Absolutely not. And on a related note, I should also point out that that we often even in sociological discussion, when we talk about this food regime, we very quickly jump to capitalism, which is fine generally, except state socialist economies, with the possible exception of Cuba, too, have not really deviated from this food regime. They may have deviated from its relations of property and its relations of production, but in terms of its fundamental epistemology, it is equal. They say state socialist regimes have been equally wedded to what Rajeshwari Rana calls the productionist paradigm. Third point is that this agriculture is environmentally destructive, and it will remain environmentally destructive even with the so-called smartness of gene editing and AI bots and satellite sensed micro irrigation practices, and so on and so forth. Environmental blindness is hard coded into its DNA, if you will allow the mixing of metaphors. Fourth, addressing agricultural sustainability by farming ecologically can address many problems. And it can address many problems that we ordinarily do not connect with food and agriculture, such as the problems of mass unemployment, the problems of health. But it does mean that new habits of eating that many of us have acquired in about maybe a generation and a half or two will need to change. And on this front, we need massive amounts of research on, literally one could go here microecology by microecology of what a sustainable agriculture looks like. And then there is an equally important question, which, at least in my view, and so far as have I read it, the literature on agroecology does not really address, is to what extent can ecological agriculture or sustainable agriculture meet the demands and address the demands of socio-economic justice. And on a final point, and this is really a broader note, except that, I fully confess that I've been, for the lack of a better word, extremely distressed by this dance of death that just happened on the international border. Um, and it has certainly not lost on a lot of farm unions in Punjab that all this machismo about war that is come out from both countries, that has been broadcast from both countries, will means enormous destruction of fertile lands, of agropastoral territories. It means pollution that will last generations. It means needless death of innocent, not civilians really, but again, primary producers, and also primary producers who for various reasons have enlisted in the military. And it I think it's important to remember that the moment we talk about ecological futures and sustainable agriculture, it has to be a subcontinental effort, because ecology is not constrained, is not limited by national boundaries, as at least the residents of NCR know very well, as do the residents of Punjab on both sides of the border. And this is, I feel, a much more productive task that must be taken at the subcontinental scale, uh, because the problem, again, is not restricted by national borders. And I don't want to end on a note of gloom and doom, because I'm extremely enthused by developments happening in Mexico at this point, where Mexico is taking on at taking on certain things which the US government simply believes is not up for debate. They're debating those, they are questioning glyphosate, they're talking about what to do with GM corn. And this is happening through its state scientific institutions, it is happening through presidential decrees, it is happening through, of course, it is being pushed by grassroots grassroots farmers and environmental movements. And if Mexico can do that, South Asia can too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aga, for flagging those 5 points off, and I'm sure that we can come back to them in the discussion and Q&A. So now I request Professor Vasavi to give her a presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Aniket. You made some very sharp observations, and I think I'll just take off from there. So basically, I would want to look at the the title, the key ideas that you all have flagged, which is what then has sustained inequalities in rural India, and looking at the impact on food and ecological futures. To understand the very nature of change of why there are these sharpened inequalities, I link it to two sets of forces that are contradictory forces in rural India. One is an economics of neglect, especially since the 1990s, the failure of our governments, the states, to deploy adequate funds support to the rural, especially agricultural sector, marked by not only decreasing state intervention, but also all sorts of investments into the rural. So to compensate for that in a context of democracy, especially competitive electoral democracy, there has been what I call a politics of rescue. We know that many of the rural agrarian programs, including MNREJ, the extension of PDS, the moratorium on loans, all this range of so-called what outsiders, urbanites would call freebies, have really been declared at the election time, and has been part of the vote bank, catering especially to the dominant castes and the large landowners. So the effect of this overall, I think, and I'm simplifying this a lot, has been a reproduction of the caste-based agrarian structure into very sharpened inequalities, which I would just summarize very quickly as generating not just 2 or 3 types of class distinctions, but a range, including now, I think, from 14 to 16 types of classes you find in rural India. But to just very simplify these, I would say that the class differences, which are reflecting in different kinds of inequalities, one, we would have to look at the extent to which the landless classes and the small and marginal farmers are now facing tremendous forms of precarity, of inabilities to sustain themselves, mostly because of old subsistence level kinds of agriculture are being eroded, which Aniket described very well, increasing commercialization, entry into capitalist agriculture, etc. So what you see among these two, and they represent what I have been calling a marginalized majority, is a new form of pauperism, in which there may not be starvation that you'd had earlier, but definite forms of nutrient deficiencies, so lack of good local food that you see that is not available. You have a de-skilling and erosion of knowledge and skills, an increasing loss of autonomy, and therefore increasing dependency on the state. You have what Aniket described, and I see it as very strongly linked to the PDS system, where basic calorie-based food, basic amounts are available, but it has changed the food basket. Local food baskets and local food cultures have declined very sharply, which accounts for malnutrition. And the shocking figures we have that up to about 24% of our children below 5 are stunted, which is really a matter of deep shame. An increase in indebtedness, and also an increase in illness, which many studies are showing are linked to the consumption of calorie-rich foods, just rice and wheat, without the associated local nutrient foods, diabetes, BP. arthritis, but more particularly the spread of cancer, which again Aniket flagged is to the use of very harmful chemicals, pesticides, including fungicides, herbicides now in agriculture, in which it is the landless laborers and small marginal workers exposed to the harms of these. And we see all of this in the context of increasing mediatization and therefore tremendous demands for income, for consumption, etc. among these groups. And also this is the category and class group which are recording very high numbers of suicide. In the middle group, which is much more differentiated than the earlier ones, who are able to get some kind of income from external, either migration or by selling of labor, increases in actual real wages, etc., benefits of joining the urban economy, remittance economy, you see a middle classization of the rural middle class groups, which accounts for all the new numbers that are showing that in rural consumption is increased. This is the class in which you have a new retail sector catering to them. You have the spread of new foods. Maggi, for example, is very popular. Maggi sweets and bakery items, again, which are now being documented as reasons for not only new forms of obesity, but all forms of illnesses. So we are seeing a very sharp change in local food cultures, but linking again to the shifts that are taking place. The third group, which is much more small, but very important for us to understand the forms of rural inequalities, are the landowners, if not landlords, who, because of the change in new land reforms, which is the opening of the market, privileging both capitalization of agriculture, but also investments from external agencies. But these people who are able to invest in the urban small cities, even in big cities, have actually risen to become regional satraps. They represent the dominant caste and the upper caste, and are both in the legislative assemblies and in the parliament. It is this caste class group whose power is based on the voting system, on the electoral system, but who really do not represent the interests of much of the rural citizens. So it is this hierarchy that we need to keep in mind to understand the impact not only on food cultures, which I've just gone into, but to the reproduction of the multiple forms of violence and multiple forms of inequalities that are present. In some ways, we also need to see this kind of shift into not only agrarian shift, but the class differentiation, the role of the government, the presence of the state has in its political avatars, and the integration, what I have been calling the adverse integration of rural India into the larger dominant capitalist urban economy, which means that there is an appropriation of natural local resources, appropriation of labor, and including a recirculation of local capital, rural capital back into the urban sectors. So it's in this context that we also are witness to the onset of tremendous ecological degradation, which is now exacerbating the impact of climate change. I want to flag three types of separations that this kind of capitalist agriculture and the role of the state and the changed administrative systems in which even the panchayat systems are really subordinate to the larger regional satrap kind of political system. It means there is a separation of ecology from agriculture, which again Aniket describes so well. Agriculture conducted irrespective of the nature of ecology. So even in a dry, arid region in which there is no perennial water or regular rainfall, tube wells are facilitating the growth of, say, grapes and turmeric or exotic fruits and vegetables, are now what you're seeing the largest kind of spread of, which is growing corn, maize, American corn, primarily for the poultry industry and for making ethanol, and is also now slowly entering into the food cultures of range of things. The second kind of separation, which also has ecological impact, is which we're seeing in the food system, is the separation of production from consumption. So earlier, most people, where there was diverse poly kind of agriculture, you would have people eating local foods, but that shift where you are growing crops in which you do not eat and what you eat is primarily coming from the PDS system, it means that there is that disjunction or separation of production from consumption. It accounts for not only malnutrition, but also the fact that it is devastating of local ecologies, which I just mentioned, not only growing corn, but has documentation across the belts, growing of soya bean. Richa Kumar's study describes it for Madhya Pradesh. Now we have excellent studies for Andhra Pradesh, parts of Maharashtra. What is the impact of growing sugarcane and cotton in these belts? Marathwada currently is in a deep crisis, which mainstream media is not reporting, in which large numbers of villages do not have basic drinking water available to them. Thirdly, the kind of separation links to the caste differentiation, which is the separation of production from reproduction. There is a contradiction in which large landowners, their families, men only visit the villages for production time to supervise cultivation, to collect grains, etc. But their families, the women, children, etc., would be in towns or cities sent for education or for better standards of living, etc. So men are migrating out and leaving women and children behind in the villages. All of these combine not only to reproduce forms of inequalities, but very strongly have impacts both on the food cultures and, as I've explained, on the ecological conditions of people. What I think is very important to understand in highlighting this reproduction of these inequalities through major structural features is the extent to which it is not just a combination of a macroeconomy that impacts local conditions, but an articulation of macroeconomic and political factors with micro socio-cultural conditions. This accounts also for the fact that increasingly the family and the household in rural areas are the sites of great contestations, in which differences between castes are played out in terms of the social dynamics. As young children have gone to schools, high schools and colleges, where inter-caste marriages, romances have increased, we also see families, community, cultures beating down on them, and we have this horrific cases of intercaste, not only violence, but honor killings, etc. But large numbers of intercaste violence is really an expression of the deep embeddedness and increasingly entrenchment of inequalities. So to conclude, I want to say that in understanding inequalities, we need to look not mostly at inequalities as primarily economic or social, but also very importantly, as flagged in the title of what you talked about, to see it in food cultures and in the erosion of natural resources and exacerbated by climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vasavi. And now I request our third speaker, Dr. Krishnamurthy, to give a talk.
Thank you. Thanks so much to all of you for organizing this panel. It's a real pleasure to be here with both Aniket and Vasavi, from whose work one has learned so much over the years. And also I see Carol Upadhyay and Richa Kumar are here. And again, we're all learning, I think, constantly from each other and the work that's been done. So that's really exciting to have everyone here. Also, I think what's wonderful as you think about this anniversary is that it's great to see this theme that traverses these three groups: agrarian and rural studies, sociology and the environment, and food culture and society, because I think these are the intersections that are really at play. So I think when we're talking about particularly the questions of inequalities, we have to work at the intersection. And I think this is so important that you've brought these different groups together. I want to build a little bit, because I think both Aniket and Vasavi have already laid out a lot of both the structure and the dynamics of what is happening, and how inequality is certainly at the heart of the current system in which we are working. So I think that that has been incredibly well done. I thought what I do, building particularly, I thought the three types of separation that you talked about, Vasavi, were just brilliant. But I thought what I'd try and do is the opposite and see what sociology can do in terms of bringing things together. Because I think the separation is what is happening, both in practice. And at the same time, I think the thing about sociology is it is both grounded and empirical, but it also has this imagination and this ability for us to see connections where actually people separate. And therefore, maybe as we think ahead in terms of what we can, as sociologists and anthropologists and ethnographers and political economists, do, think through some of this. As I think Dr. Manisha mentioned right at the beginning, I come to this from work in agricultural markets in Madhya Pradesh, but also in Bihar, Odisha, of Karnataka and Punjab. And from the field, what you find as soon as you get into these places, that a lot of the separations that we make, both conceptually and in terms of legislation often and policy, between production, processing, exchange, distribution, and consumption are actually deeply interrelated. And changes in the sphere of one affect these other elements. And often even this listing, it's very hard to figure out where to put processing. Do you put processing right after production? Is it part of production? Does it come after exchange? Like milling is a different type of processing than the kind of processing that farmers might do on the field before selling. So these are really complicated. And as soon as you hit the ground, you see these connections rather than the disconnections. And you start seeing the ways in which they affect each other deeply. I think the second point, both I think Aniket and Vasavi have talked about already, is the nature of commercialization, the unevenness, but also the pace of commercialization. And when it comes to food, I think historically there is no other sector, no other practice, no other part of life which has and experiences as much breathless commodification, where it almost feels like there's limitless possibilities for new manners of commodification and commercialization, but also has historically faced breathtaking resistance and limits placed on this kind of commercialization. So we always see the political economy and the moral economy together when it comes to food and agriculture. It's very hard, even in the most rampant stages of commercialization and commodification, you also see the limits. I think E.P. Thompson used to talk about this is where the moral economy of the crowd came from, the way of thinking about what happens with these radiating complexities. And I think in food and in agriculture and in ecology, this is where you see these limits also placed. And I think it's really important for us as ethnographers to also note the limits and note the resistance and understand the nature of the limits that are placed and the new possibilities that emerge when these limits are placed. I thought, just building on Vasavi, I would point out to 5 kinds of things that in a sense are separations, but also are coming together, right? And I think you mentioned the differentiation of farmers and rural classes and the proliferation of different types of class categories. And I think when we think about types of farmers, we usually still, when it comes to land, default into large, medium, small. We talk about landed and landless. We talk about men and women. But I think this is one area where we still see, and this is where I think Indian sociology and Indian agriculture is so different than many parts of the world. You still see enormous resistance to what people would imagine would be the course of structural transformation, right? Like the assumption that we would proletarianize completely, that small farmers would not hold on, has long existed since the Green Revolution, even before that. And Indian farmers have not done so, right? It doesn't mean that they exist in some wonderful context, right? That this is some great situation where we have a wonderful and well-off agrarian, a group of agriculturalists. But I would say that it is remarkable that we still have as much farming as we do. It is also important for us to remember that farmers are therefore numerically the largest when we talk about consumers. And the amount of production that still happens for own consumption is it's not insignificant. So while I completely agree, it's absolutely true, the point about the PDS, the separation of production and consumption, there is still more production for consumption and for the possibility of consumption. I remember before COVID, when we were doing research in Odisha, farmers, we asked them, how come you haven't left this land or left, you earn more from labor in any case. And they all said, when the cities close, we will come back and grow paddy. And this was startling. In some senses, for most people, they see it as the great failure of India's structural transformation. But it also tells you about this other dynamic. So I think one is how we think about the fact that we still have farmers growing for themselves in certain places. We still have greater amounts of seed sovereignty or the ability to retain seed, which I know in many other parts of the world is absolutely not a possibility. And so there are these, we can think of them as residual, but they're also the opening of possibility. Right. And I think lots of organizations on the ground, Aniket's work on seeds, for example, very inspiring precisely because they're working against the odds, but there is still possibility, right? There is still the scope for thinking about some of these kinds of things. So the first is farmers also as producers, and that is still a significant part of, and certainly in certain parts of India, very much so. And linked to that is the types of crops, right? So of course, we don't find that in the same way in states like Punjab and Haryana. Even in Madhya Pradesh, when it comes to soybean, Richa's work or my work will show the amount, you don't grow it for consumption. It's clearly a cash crop. That was not true of wheat in soybean, in Madhya Pradesh. And of course, after procurement of wheat, even that has changed. Wheat has also become much more of a cash crop. Varieties have diminished. It has become much more standardized. But again, there, I think the types of crops, both perishable, non-perishable, these produce very specific kinds of inequality. So cash and food, perishable, non-perishable, the nature of industrial potential in these crops, right? Barbara Harris-White often talks about quiddity, the thinginess of commodities. I think we must pay attention to the particular kinds of inequality that are produced by different sorts of crops and the ways in which multi-crop growing farmers balance these inequalities, these tensions, find ways of both negotiating and saving, but also, of course, then find themselves in trouble in different ways. I think the third kind of thing I wanted to think a little bit about here was farmers and intermediaries. I think, again, we tend to separate out, when we talk about intermediaries, we just think of them in agriculture, in food, in the sector, in a very homogeneous way, as middlemen, as intermediaries, as middlemen traders. We talk of them as those who are getting in the way, certainly in policy dialogue. And I think one of the biggest contributions sociologists and anthropologists make is we complexify, we make much more complicated our understanding of intermediation in India. And what is the scale of intermediation? Because just like we have a vast number of small farmers and petty producers, we also have a very vast number of small intermediaries. And the nature of their role is vital, right? They don't just play distortionary roles at all. In many cases, they are actually quite important. I remember in food markets, one time sitting with an arte and a sabzi mandi who said, this crop, he said, kachi nahi bikti hai aur pakki nahi rukti hai, right? Like it will not sell when it is raw and it's not ripe enough, but it will not wait either, right? And it is between this ripening and rotting that these intermediaries operate. And I think it's really vital when we think about the fact that we do not have large, well-organized public markets. We do not have good public infrastructure. Many of the times, these intermediaries are the ones who play that role, carry the risk, but also shape food preferences, also find linkages, right? And also exploit farmers and consumers. So if you look at the quality of our markets, whether it is in terms of pesticide use, whether it is in terms of the quality of things, we see a huge problem here. And so I think, again, intermediaries are not at all innocent. I don't mean to glorify them, but I think we bring complexity when we think about, right, intermediation here. And I think it's extremely important to do so, to be able to separate corporate, small scale, middle scale, thinking about medium-sized traders, thinking about the formal and the informal, thinking about the nature of intermediation in these markets, and to realize that disintermediation has been taken over as a term, which actually enables centralization and enables the taking away of local markets and control, right? So I think while historically sociologists have ended up often very rightly pointing out the forms of exploitation that farmers experience at the hands of intermediaries, I think we're in a new system where we need to also try and understand the potential for local capital, regional capital to be reimagined, and to have a vision and imagination for this sector, which we don't have at the moment at all. I mean, I think this became very apparent during the farm laws debate, where we thought the private sector and the public sector, and this is another separation I want to make here, that I want to bring together. We thought the private sector referred only to the corporate sector. That was the discourse. We need more corporate sector. And what we must remember is that agricultural sector in India is overwhelmingly private, and it is overwhelmingly entrepreneurial. And it is small-scale mid-size entrepreneurship. And the kind of consolidation that we have seen of food markets in other parts of the world has still not happened here. It does not mean it cannot happen. And it does not mean that there are lots of movements to make it happen, in which the state plays a very critical role. But I think there is still an opportunity to think about this sector and this space in a much more creative way. So finally, I'll just point out to one more place that I think gets separated when we talk about food markets and when we talk about food and agriculture, which is the urban and the rural. And we know this from history in India. I think David Ludden said it once, where for the longest time, urbanization in India happened within agriculture. If you live in cities like in Bangalore, or you live in Delhi, where we have Azadpur, these are vast agrarian cities. These are not cities which are just metropolitan cities. They are deeply agrarian in the sense that the agrarian involves consumption of agriculture. The agrarian also has seasonality. Our cities still do at the largest level. But I want to point to the small towns again, the middle-sized towns, the small towns, which is actually where urbanization in India is also happening. And these are deeply connected to the agrarian and to food systems. And so the agrarian in India has always been more than rural, and the rural has always been more than agriculture. Here again, I think we have to think in new ways, open up and understand these linkages in different ways. I think anthropologists and sociologists have a very important role to play here in terms of how we make this kind of relationships visible and apparent. And so I would like to just put that there and then say that I think Vasvi's already talked about the state, but the role of the state is absolutely crucial here. And it's about the terms of diversification. Agriculture has always been in a state of movement. If you do well in agriculture, you tend to diversify out of agriculture or take it along with you. If you do badly in agriculture, you also diversify. It's a question of whether you are having distress-driven diversification or diversification on stronger terms. And the nature of that diversification, the nature of the diversity, will depend greatly on public institutions, public organization, public investment, and ultimately how we define public value. This is true for whether it's about food standardization and food safety, whether it's about regulation and the nature of competition, whether it is about the kinds of inputs or outputs and the way markets are structured. So I would just like to put that there, to say that the role of the state in determining the terms of this diversification is very crucial. So thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnamurthy. So thank you to all three of the speakers for basically commenting on larger theoretical methodological questions around the broader theme of the panel discussion on sustaining inequality, agrarian change, food cultures, and ecological futures. So I now open up the discussion to our audience. And if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat box, or alternatively, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Yes, so if anyone is ready, please go ahead.
Thank you for this very interesting themes that are being discussed together, because these are separate issues. We often see them as separate issues, but they aren't. So my question is to Mekhala Krishnamurthy. So I have just to introduce myself. So I have worked on Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, the social farmers movement, and the way they are resisting their two new kinds of shifts in orientation, talking about food sovereignty and agroecological practices, particularly natural farming, and also applying Subhash Palekar's model of natural farming. So I'm currently also working in West Bengal and looking at the different organic organized movements and food related several civil society organizations in the state. So how they are resisting and how they are thinking about engaging with the market. So that is what brings me to this kind of a realization that there are several pockets in the country which are trying to build agroecological practices and also engage with the market, particularly what we see in Karnataka with the new initiative of Namdu, where they are holding these local markets in the city. So there is seriously what I realize is a lack of markets for these producers who are trying to make food which is agroecological, and who is also trying to engage with the market. So that means how do these then small pockets become larger, scale up? And as you correctly point out, that there are various small scale entrepreneurs who are actually also thinking about engaging with this intermediation, role of intermediation from the producer to the market. Now, these are all organic or natural farming products. So why don't they reach the commercial market? And what are the questions about how to scale them up, and what role does the state play here? Because while we see a lot of talk about changing food production, there's a lot of activism, a lot of movements, a lot of NGOs who are working on it. The market side of it is not very developed, as I have also realized from the field, that the farmers say that yes, we can produce, but there's no labeling, there is no different kind, and there's no way to sell these products. So they often sell in the same price. So lower or maybe higher. So how do we work with the market? So if you can throw some light on this issue, that why do these small pockets of change that we see, they often don't reach the mainstream market, and what role does the state play there? And also related to this is that we see a lot of small corporate bodies, small businesses. Like I know some people who are engaging in these small businesses of creating brands. So what they do is they often supply these, lots of millets, lots of, red rice, brown rice being, packaged and sold to a particular brand. So this branding that's happening, this is also being sold at a very high price. So how does this, relate to the ground level social transformation that we're thinking of to really change consumption practices, production practices, and production which takes into account the local ecology and the social context of different classes and castes of farmers? So if you can tell us something about that a bit, that's my first personal question.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you,
Thank you.
Nilushri. Yeah.
Thank
Dr. Krishnamurthy, would you like to answer, or should I collect a few more questions, because there are some raised hands?
Sure, we could collect maybe a couple of questions, and then I've noted this in detail, so we can, yeah.
Let me request all the participants to keep their questions short so that we have more time for the discussion. Sabari, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. My query is like, it's not a new question, but like I just want to know the scholar's insight on this. Like like Dr. Aniket was talking about this agroecology and like sustainable agriculture, offering a lot of solutions to both farmers and also in like nutrition wise. I mean, like it's offering a lot of. But the thing is, like, there is also, I also noticed that like the state lately state has also taken up the question of agroecology, and then Shaila's Asia Galvin's work on Uttarakhand, or so where the state directly involves in creating this organic brand. But there are also it also like operates through other organizations in various states or various regions in India. And it's actually some of the organizations are not even like directly related to agriculture, but like they take up this question of agroecology and like this organic agriculture or jaivik kheti and stuff like that. So what I generally see is that I mean, it actually hampers the creation of solidarity amongst the farmers who are inclined towards agroecology. And every state in India has its own. I mean, the agroecology in every state in India has its own ideological connotations. So, in Maharashtra, it's different, and in Uttarakhand, it's different, and it's like in Tamil Nadu, it's Kerala and Tamil Nadu, it's different, and like so. So, what is your take on it? I mean, is it actually the case, or I mean, does it actually hamper, like, is there any way in which the farmers can overcome this ideological divide within the other level of discourse and practice within agroecology?
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Sabari. I see another raised hand. Tanvi, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, firstly, I'd just like to thank the panel very quickly. And I'd like to keep my question very brief. I was just wondering about, when we think about microecological studies, I was thinking about if you could share your thoughts on what mechanisms could also safeguard the findings of these microecological studies, so that any sustainable practices that are operating on a very small scale do not immediately become exposed to and then extinguished by market forces. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Krishnamurthy, maybe you can respond first. Yes.
Yeah, I'll respond, and I suppose in the process of the response also try to take in both Sabari's question as well on the state. But so to Nilushri's question, I mean, I think this has been the very, very tough question, right? Of how do you build and how do you think about these markets? And what you often hear from farmers, but you'll also hear it from policymakers, you'll also hear it from FPOs, is often the thing that market access is a problem, or markets are a problem. Now, one of the things that you have, I mean, I always think is that if a farmer sells any of their produce for cash, right? By cash, I mean there's a monetary transaction, the market has accessed you. It's not about you access, it's not about market access, it is markets access people, right? In these, when commercialization happens. So if you sell even a proportion, and you very rarely have full commercialization, like I said, farmers retain seed, they often retain a certain amount for consumption, etc. But if you sell a certain amount, it's about the terms of your engagement in that market, right? And this is true, of course, one of the most common things people say about farmers and markets anywhere. This is true for all of us who have done any research with farmers and markets anywhere. Farmers will say we are the only producers who can never give the price, right? We are the only producers who we're always price takers. The other thing farmers will always say is that they buy in retail and sell in wholesale. So they never benefit from the kind of market, sort of power dynamics that exist, right? And so they face a huge number of things. And part of the work, I think, of various organizations, whether it's FPOs, whether it's the state, is about strengthening the terms of engagement in markets. When it comes to organic markets, natural farming, non-pesticides, or pesticide-free markets, these are all, it adds the complexity, right? Because our wholesale markets typically actually have a pretty strong nose for differentiation of commodities and of quality and variety. But unless in the actual consumption market, there is a value to have that differentiation, you will not actually benefit from it in the competitive wholesale market, right? Which is why these farmers often find the mandi, while it will give you a price for mud and it will give you a price for various things, will not necessarily give you the price you're looking for when it comes to some of this, because it'll mix it in with where the mainstream market price is actually going. And so therefore you have to build more complex channels, all of which have market, which are part of the market, and figure out. And so that's the work that organizations are currently doing, right? Which is actually building, it's not building new markets as much as building brands at the other end, or commodity categories at the other end, right? And there you see huge number of challenges. I think the critical question is, why do you need to scale, and at what level do you need to scale? It doesn't mean you don't need some scale or you don't need value appreciation. But a lot of the puzzle happens where you start thinking, I need the same amount, right? Even with farmers, when you talk to them about pricing, they'll often say, I would like this price, 2,000. And then the mandi price gets to 2,000 and they're still not selling. And I'll be like, but you said you're okay with this price. And they're like, now we'll see what happens with the higher price. But the point is that their economics at the household level or their economics at the FPO level are different, right, from large scale corporate entities. And their understanding of value is also different. It is not just commercial value or market value. Of course, a big part of that is income, livelihood, improving your own conditions, improving your own both consumption as well as your production and your income. But unless you are actually thinking differently about value, you will actually reproduce mainstream market practices and commercial practices, which is what typically often ends up happening, right? You end up doing what everybody else is doing because you don't have a different definition of value. Like, this is enough for this organization. One of the FPOs I work with actually says, we don't want to make profit beyond this. We don't want to go beyond this market. We want to actually add more commodities and or crops and change how we're thinking about this regional economy rather than thinking about export, right? And so I think part of the problem is when people come into this space, if you're thinking about it from the how do you optimize profit, you start thinking about scale in a certain way. If you're thinking about it from the point of view of the growth of value, right? Public, which is of different levels, that has got an element of income, but also larger, different kinds of things, ecological value. And because pricing doesn't always bring this in, right? This is why the role of the state is very important. Because the market price may not give you adequately, right? This is the point about why we did food security. It wasn't the market price. When we did the PDS, it wasn't the market price for wheat. It was the price government was willing to give for you to increase the production of a certain kind of crop, which we needed for food security. So it wasn't a market logic. Right now, the big problem with the PDS, people say, oh, it's distorted the market and we don't have a market for wheat. But the point is not that. The point is the government and public organizations can value things differently so that farmers can reduce costs in certain ways, can actually grow their income, their ecology in a different way. And that is where I think the kind of public organizations that Sharbari was talking about are not the ones we have, right? We built a certain kind of extension system a certain kind of system thinking about scale, markets, or PDS, but that wasn't actually thinking about crops, thinking about agroecology, thinking about diversification, thinking about markets. We had that imagination, but we didn't do it. We didn't build the strength of institutions. So at one point we had commodity boards, which were supposed to think in these creative ways. We had extension, but we never decentralized and empowered them to the level that we should have. Whether it was the building of public infrastructure. We all know actually exhibition spaces, haats, bazaars, market spaces are hugely important for small scale artisanal producers, right? Web portals are not always required. What you actually need is physical good infrastructure where people can come, look at the crops, sell, exchange, have elements of market and non-market exchange interacting to create value. Those kinds of organizations and the imagination. So the Millet Mission in Odisha is interesting because it has tried to bring that imagination, right, as an organization within government. I think we need a lot more of that. We need, standardization cannot be corporate branding standards only when you have a large informal economy. We know phytosanitary conditions are like non-tariff barriers. Right? They use these standards to keep small producers out of the market. So we need to have a different understanding of what is quality, what is safety. That does take these things into account. That is technically sound. And I want to repeat this. One of the biggest problems, Aniket will be able to talk much more about science and institutions of science. But what we have done historically is we have separated out the technical and the implementation. So we haven't actually built strong technical institutions that interact with implementation, decentralized implementation institutions. And that is required for markets, it's required for production, it's required for all elements of what we are talking about here. And that I think is something that we can do, we must do. We have to, work with civil society, work with scientific organizations, etc. to do it. So to me, I think I'll answer the first two questions. I think on microecological studies, others will have more insight and better guidance. But to me, this is a major challenge. I think lots of farmers organizations, those thinking about agroecological practice are struggling with this. And my answer would be that we need to take a much, much more, I think, both contextual and comprehensive view in the building of public organizations, the targeting and use of public investment, as well as in the support to collectives of different kinds.
Thank you. Professor Vasavi, would you like to respond? There's also a question for you in the chat box. Jennifer, if you're around, maybe you could unmute yourself and ask the question, or maybe if it's more comfortable for you, you could also type it in the chat box. So, Professor Vasavi, would you like to respond to the other question in the chat box or any of the questions that were asked?
Yeah, no, I think Mekhala has provided comprehensive responses to the very important issues of market. I won't take that on, but I'm not even sure about this question on microecological studies and safeguards. Does it mean that these, are the practices or what they are growing need to be safeguarded from market forces? I'm not able to understand what the question is.
I have a feeling the question was about, like, if you overexpose these practices in research, do we make them vulnerable to certain kinds of commercialization, capture? In fact, Aniket, for example, the work on seeds, right? If you're trying to do some work, do we make it vulnerable to commercialization by, sort of sharing this kind of knowledge? That's what I understood from the question. But
Just a point.
Yes, precisely.
Which is important. The work on seeds is actually Chitrangada Chaudhary's. I'm more of a collaborator there. It's not my work on seeds.
No, just assuming you have watched it many times and understood the work quite well. But we can all talk about that. Like, it's, yeah.
Yeah, Vasavi, why don't you? I have a thought or two on that.
Yeah. No, same here. I think it is a concern about, appropriation and patenting. especially in the context where a lot of practices and agricultural resources like seeds, etc., are being appropriated by agribusiness agencies. But I'm not aware of if anything has happened so far. I think the importance of documenting these in detail is to show their viability and to, in a context where much of these are being eroded, to legitimize them at a larger platform, to unpack their own scientific basis and the fact that they're also forms of knowledge systems. So I think that priority, outweighs these kinds of concerns. But I think it's also important maybe to be wary of, encroachment and appropriation.
Yeah, Dr. Aga, would you like to respond? And I think
Yeah, I'll
Richard
just
also asked you a question in the chat box. Shall I read it out?
I've seen the question.
Okay.
It's a very serious question. Well, but before that, I just want to add a point or two to what Mekhala has just said, and as has Vasavi. Actually, yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I think I can make a reference to the film here, Seed Stories by Chitrangada, which I collaborated, because one of the characters in it has written and thought very hard about, which is Dr. Deval Dev. He has spent more than a decade thinking about this question of ecologically attuned agricultural practices that resist a certain kind of commercial appropriation. So I can, for a longer answer, I can refer you to that work by Dr. Deval Dev. But in very briefly, a lot of ecologically attuned agriculture does not lend itself to packaging. It is things which people practice. It is the kind of alignments of environmental cues, knowledge and insight born of experience and memory coming together, which is why, I mean, it's worth exploring, but it's worth systematically exploring. But nonetheless, ecologically attuned agriculture does offer much more of a role to the farmers who are practicing it. They are not buying off-the-shelf products. Strictly speaking, agroecologically, if you're buying off-the-shelf products, then you're not really bringing down the ecological footprint of agriculture. So that is one, one thing to think about. The other is, as exactly as Mekhala said, that market forces, if you want to frame the discussion so broadly, then in a way it's unhelpful, because we have to remember that trade in food and trade in seeds is ancient. It predates imperialism, it predates capitalism, it predates the post-capitalist alternatives to capitalism. So the question always is, what kind of market forces, what kind of trade, on whose terms? Can I take Dr. Kumar's question, Richa's question? The latest controversy around gene-edited rice and its implications. Again, briefly, all the problems that we've been talking about for the past hour and 15 minutes will not be addressed by gene editing. Implications are that we have allowed a rice into the market without any labeling, without knowing what regulatory tests it was subjected to. The BT eggplant, BT brinjal controversy, thereafter the GM mustard controversy, whatever one thinks of them, and wherever one lands on the spectrum of what to do about these crops, certainly generated a lot of data and public information for people to think about. None of that has happened for gene edited rice. And in the absence of labeling, we don't know we don't know what we will be consuming, where all it will go. I'm assuming basmati has been kept out of it, at least formally, because of the worry for the export organic market. But then again, I'm not entirely sure that gene editing can be contained in these terms. So, in brief, it is actually something to be terribly concerned about. But because of the way the rules have been framed for gene edited crops, and I would say an artificial distinction has been made to keep them out of the purview of Rules 1989 under Environment Protection Act, we have very few handles to, interrogate and potentially critique these decisions.
Okay.
So, if I understand Jennifer, I don't know if she's here, but I think she's talking about, if she's talking about ecological, not unecological, non-farm, like mining and industry, which causes other kinds of ecological damage, but are important for farmers who also depend on employment. And that nexus, is that, Jennifer, is that what you were referring to there? Or were you referring to other kinds of labor, non-farm labor? That's okay. Anyway, I think the farm, non-farm is a real complication. And I mean, it's a complexity, it's an old linkage. But also we have to just remember that, like I said, farm and non-farm have existed for a very long time. And of course, there's industrial labor. And then there are questions in forest areas and in other areas about extraction. And so there's really lots of different forms of non-farm. There is also non-farm labor, which is not as agroecologically problematic, but engages people in different ways. And artisanal work and other things have always done that as well, right? And so, again, I think it's one of those separations that we have seen at different scales that we kind of need to understand much better, because the farm and the non-farm were also much more integrated and can be again in a different way. I think Niloshi.
Any final remarks, Professor Vasavi or Dr. Aga?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay. I don't think there are any other questions from the participants. Niloshri has a raised hand. Yeah.
Yeah, shall I just speak one?
Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
I just had a question to like all three speakers, whoever would like to respond to this, because with regard to this agroecology that we see, the kind of public consciousness and the effort of the state and several organizations, we also there is a certain overlapping or a connection between environmental concerns, ecological concerns, and also indigeneity and nativism, a certain kind of nationalism, where the concept of the cow, the soil, and the seeds are also understood by the government and particular kinds of ideological frameworks that, this is something which is very closely related to our ancient civilization and Indian culture, traditional knowledge, and all of that. So how do you see this kind of a movement where this is great ecologically, but there's also a certain kind of ideological packaging that's happening? So if any one of you can comment on that.
Would anyone of you like to respond?
I can just start off by just saying, and turn to Aniket, but look, just like he said, trade is ancient. I think ideological packaging and ideological contestation over agroecology, trade, food, commodities, and all is also ancient. And it happens in every era in different ways, right? So there's a current ideological packaging of one thing. There's also the corporate ideological capitalism. It's also happening simultaneously. Sometimes there's a potent mixture of the two, as we see with large corporate conglomerates on Ayurveda and other things that we have today. It becomes, a certain kind of relationship. In others, it's a small scale. So it's very diverse. I think there's huge contestation and there are many cracks. in all of this. One of the most interesting seminars I recently attended there was a discussion on fortification of food. And, you know, the Right to Food campaign and the Swadeshi Jagran Manch were on the same page against fortification, like of rice, right? Iron fortification, as were Indian scientists who said this is going to produce, you know, could produce a level of toxicity. And one of the things is that it's all tied up to a certain ideology around, in some cases, religion, in some cases, agroecology, in some cases, traditional knowledge, but it's also tied up with constitutionalism and with other things. So there was this wonderful moment where the person from the Swadeshi Jagran Manch said, it is my constitutional right not to have iron fortified rice. And you can imagine some colleagues from Kerala said it was their constitutional right to consume other things that the same gentleman may not like, right? But the constitution also provides certain rights. We have the perennial trouble that, you know, millet producing areas have, where millet producers will say, we want to eat rice and wheat, and what is the problem? You know, so these have always been really, you know, the dynamism is huge and the contradiction is huge. I would say our job as to point out a contradiction is sometimes important and yet not sufficient, right? As anthropologists and sociologists, we're very good at pointing out complexity and contradiction. But we have to work with it to understand what the conditions of possibility is it opening up, right? What kinds of unlikely possibilities for a better situation is it potentially opening up, right? That's why I use the word imagination to begin with. We have to have much greater imagination in all of this. Sometimes I think this instability and the contradictions of ideology and practice are not bad places to insert oneself and be very practical, pragmatic, realistic about what is actually going on. And what might happen. But long teleological things tend to be very persuasive, but less agile in actually securing change. Aniket, you were about to jump in when I took off.
Yeah, I on the whole agree with what you said. I would just add that there's nothing which cannot be appropriated by any ideological agenda, right? Is there anything which cannot be appropriated by pick any point in the political spectrum? So I think it's important. I think what is important is that we keep our eye on the ecological logic and on the logic of social, economic, caste, etc. justice, gender justice. I mean, and sometimes there are people that we might otherwise disagree with who will agree with us for not for our reasons, for different reasons, and that gets us into political practice and strategic coalition building and so on and so forth. So I mean, per se, I don't think that simply because the ecological agenda too can be hijacked by chauvinist forces, that should mean that we should therefore stop championing the ecological agenda.
Thank you. Professor Vasavi, from you, anything?
Yeah, just quickly, I endorse what both Mekhala and Aniket have said. Just to add that this concern about it being ideologically co-opted needs to be qualified in the extent to which current to the dominant system are more significant than to the agroecological wave. It still is a very small wave. It's still in very small pockets. And it's facing lots of contestations from the center, which is increasingly not only centralizing agrarian issues, but also corporatizing it. So the industrial chemical model is prevailing much more. So I think in that context, what we need to see is how to revive the agroecological, and this is what I've also been talking to other people, is we need to see the agroecological model has not one type of model, but has an umbrella which incorporates many diverse forms of agroecological, agrarian, agricultural complexes. But there is a concern. For example, we know when the zero budget natural farming was promoted in Andhra, it was quickly also called spiritual farming, mostly because it got into this whole spiritual indigenous, the importance of the cow as sacred, etc. But there was also a backlash against it, and they retrieved it. They went back and they removed the spiritual farming and put back natural, community-based natural farming. So I think those internal conversations are going on, but the bigger threat is really the hegemony of the capitalist industrial chemical agriculture.
Thank you so much. So we're going to wind up now since it's almost 1.5 hours. I would like to thank our three panelists for agreeing to spend the evening talking and deliberating on such a relevant issue. I would also like to thank the Indian Sociological Society for giving this platform and bringing three RCs together. This is a new initiative as well in terms of looking at research areas as interconnected with each other. And I also thank my two other collaborators, Dr. Manisha Rao and Dr. Chandrasekhar Reddy. Dr. Chandrasekhar is facing some internet issues, so he hasn't been able to sort of, speak. And I want to thank all the participants, especially the young students and research scholars who are members of these RCs and otherwise who have attended the panel discussion. So the discussion will be later uploaded to the ISS YouTube channel, and you can go back to it and re-listen to it if you want to. So thank you once again, everyone.